My name is Roelien Theron, and I've worked on the travel and heritage titles at Penguin Random House. And I worked with Mike and with Tom on Palaces of Stone. And just very briefly to give some background about the book. Across the face of Southern Africa are the remains of more than 560 remarkable stone palaces, once the abodes of kings and chiefs. Some are large, others small, but all are absolutely astonishing. Ranging in age and spanning almost 1,000 years, the majority of these palaces are unknown to the general public, unsung and unappreciated. Yet the stonework is some of the most intricate and beautiful of any places built without mortar. So wrote Mike Main in his proposal to Struik Travel and Heritage sometime in 2019, asking that we consider publishing a book on a period in Southern Africa's history marked by an extraordinary set of events that would give rise to the region's first political states. His proposal alluded to the breadth of development in those early times, from around 900 to the mid-1800s, and promised to bring into public view the rich cultural, economic, and political history of the area. But most importantly, the mission was to make available to the general public, in the language of the layperson, what the archaeologists have known for a long time, that we might have assumed or have been told about the interior being a vast unknown space was a fallacy, and that it was in fact a place that hummed with activity, characterized by mining, farming, hunting, local and international trade, as well as administrative and cultural forms of organization. As publisher of the book, we are grateful to Mike for the approach and are extremely proud to have played a small part in encouraging a deeper appreciation of this rich heritage among the general public. So with that, let me introduce you to the authors. Mike Main, a management consultant, freelance writer, and longtime amateur archaeologist, has done much to uncover and bring to light Great Zimbabwe sites, especially in Botswana. Tom Huffman is Professor Emeritus of Archaeology at the University of the Witwatersrand. His scholarly work on pre-colonial farming societies in Southern Africa is recognized globally, and his research has greatly influenced the way we look at the early history of the region. Patricia Glyn is no stranger to us. She's a former radio and television broadcaster and published author and an adventurer and innovator of note. Her latest project has seen her living and traveling in a truck for over 2.5 years, meeting and documenting fascinating people and their stories along the way. Keep your eyes peeled for a series of podcasts about her travels. And if you want to get in touch with her, her contact details will be in the chat. Over to you, Patricia, Mike, and Tom. And we look forward to hearing your insight into this fascinating period in our history.
Thank you. Thanks, Roelien. Thank you, Struik. Thank you, Tom and Mike, for the invitation to be part of this launch. I love this book. I love this book. And I'm so admiring of the passion that it took to bring it to us. And I think it bears repeating that this is a passion that fueled these two men for over 40 years. Am I right, guys? Over 40 years. They've beaten their way through thick bush, especially Mike, I think it's fair to say, in his trusty old Land Cruiser, if that's not an advertisement. They've trawled through archives and museums and oral accounts. And the result is this really richly illustrated book. We're going to bring you a small taste of how richly it is illustrated. And it's very easily understood, digestible, you know. And I think what Roelien pointed to in her introduction is this book's most valuable contribution to our knowledge, and that is the context in which these monuments existed. Let me just remind you what she said. There are over 500 of them, over 500 to our knowledge at the moment. I'm not alone in having visited places like Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe and been, gobsmacked and all of that. But only when I read the book and after visiting 3 of the other palaces with Mike Main at the beginning of this year, did I fully understand how massive, complex, and sophisticated this empire was, and that these palaces represent. And they were at the pumping heart, of course, of an enormous trading enterprise. We will get to that. But on a personal note, the sites that Mike took me to are all on the Limpopo River. They were by no means of the same architectural standard as the biggies, but my heck are they moving. We really struggled, didn't we, Mike, to find a couple of them, even though you had discussed them so long before. But they're really beautifully positioned. These guys would make for great modern property developers, I think. They're on raised ground with magnificent views at confluences or on one of our great African rivers. And they spoke of such industry, you know, huge labor. I mean, the walls are sometimes 2 meters thick, even in the humble palaces. And you can see in certain design traditions or conventions in the walls. And we're going to get to all of that. But I would like to start with you, Mike, because you were the push, the impetus for this book. And I can almost see your legs striding through that prickly bush saying, this has got to be in the book. This has got to be in the book. Why did you feel it was timely to have a book about Great Zimbabwe and all of its cousins?
That's an interesting question. You know, I've lived in Zimbabwe for 20 years and then in Botswana for up to now another 40 years. And like everybody else, you hear about Great Zimbabwe, you see Great Zimbabwe, and you think, wow, that's amazing. But it's not until I ended up in Botswana and met people like Dr. Alec Campbell and Katrine van Waarden who talked about the ruins in Botswana that I realized that there was far more to the story than just the magnificent ruins that are the iconic ruins that we know of in Zimbabwe. And you've already said there were 560 of these ruins. And my curiosity was piqued. In Botswana alone, nobody associates Botswana with Zimbabwe culture of the time. But there are 120, 130 ruins there, and we're constantly finding new ones. So it's an untold story that needs to be told. That's why I got involved. That's why we're here tonight.
And you've already mentioned the name, the nomenclature, potential issue that we might have, and that is that this culture is referred to as the Zimbabwe culture, which might be a little bit confusing. Tom, can you take us through why it's called thus and what it actually embraces?
The Zimbabwe culture is the archaeological name for a society started by the Shona and Venda. Venda are actually Shona people who changed their language quite recently or added onto their language quite recently. This was a product of a development that has to do with class distinction. You're born a commoner or you're born a royal, and then under a sacred leader. Now, all civilizations throughout the world have this one thing in common, in that there is marked social distinction. And we have that with our Zimbabwe culture. And like other civilizations around the world, the causes of it had to do with population increase, and that had to do with successful floodplain agriculture and so on, so that you have enough people to socially differentiate. You can't really have classes in the normal sense among Bushmen because there's not enough of them. So you have to have enough people, and then you need something that allows the distinction itself, which in this case is the political economy based on long distance trade. Leaders were able to concentrate surplus wealth to separate themselves from the ordinary people. So the Zimbabwe culture includes all of that.
And just to emphasize, we're talking about a culture which spread a lot further than modern Zimbabwe's borders. I think that's where the confusion is potentially going to come in. This culture, this civilization took up an awful lot further than that.
It covered an area the size of France. Now, it wasn't, that's the whole, I mean, in common terms, you could say the empire, but it's divided up into different political states. And our timeline, which is at the very beginning of the book, shows you the main capitals through time. It's not meant to be an evolutionary sequence because the Zimbabwe culture was formed in the Limpopo Valley at a certain point in time. And then it was basically the same throughout. The changes were all have to do with politics and changes among leaders in different places and so on. Yes, you'll see there that it goes from Shota to Mapungubwe, Great Zimbabwe, Khami. Those are the names of the principal capitals. There's been quite a bit of debate on some of this. It's not to imply that one quit and the other started, but in fact, the next one was often the reason for the last one to lose its position. Mapungubwe, for example, was outcompeted by Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe was outcompeted by Khami. So they overlap, and that's why the dates aren't exactly one after the other. You'll see that they represent a span.
Yeah, but even a cursory glance at that shows you, does it not, Mike, that this was extant, this civilization, for a very, very long time. This is 900 years.
You can broadly say from 1250 right through to 1850 to make it convenient, 600 years, and the extent of it stretches from the coast. There are Zimbabwe cultural palaces near the coast in Mozambique, right through to the northwestern side of Botswana, north to the Zambezi, and south to a point somewhere on the Limpopo, halfway down Botswana's border. So it's a huge area, huge area.
But it's concentrated in this nexus between Botswana, Zim, and South Africa, largely. Now, why there?
Resources, I think, would be my quick answer. We can ask Tom that, but I would look at the gold, the copper, the game, the elephant, ivory. I would imagine that those were they were important resources that were part of the economy of trade. Tom?
Yeah, it's the area where, first of all, ordinary people could make a living as farmers and herders. And because of the gold, it's found mostly in the greenstone belt that goes from Great Zimbabwe, curves around into Francistown. That made the difference with where the trade got concentrated. There are some Arab documents that talk about the loss of ivory in East Africa, because you can only hunt elephants for so long before they leave. And they were told to go and look for new resources and to marry the local people so they could learn the language and they could communicate. And they stumbled onto ivory in the Limpopo Valley. And it wasn't long before they discovered that it was possible to pan for alluvial gold. And that made the difference to why Zimbabwe is the core, Zimbabwe and Western Botswana is the core of the Zimbabwe culture.
But we'll probably return to the trading issues in a minute, but how much of the choice of sites was governed by climate conditions, Mike?
I'm thinking about that. I think it's important to realize that for the indigenous people, who were the people who explored and exploited the gold, it was a pastime. They were agriculturists, pastoral agriculturists. Cattle were terribly important. Crops were essential. When those did not demand their time, that's when you went and looked for gold. And climate was important only insofar as Tom mentioned, where those wildlife and mineral resources are, you have to be able to live. So if the climate changes, then despite the fact that there may still be gold and ivory there, you have to move because you've got to grow crops. So yes, climate is a big part of this story.
Yeah, yeah.
May I add something there, Patricia?
Of course, Tom, go for it.
Another reason for the location of the palaces, as opposed to the culture itself, had to do with rainmaking. One of the things about sacred leadership is that you claim that you can communicate with God through your ancestors to make it rain. And ever since Mapungubwe, these palaces were built on top of old rainmaking sites, as if the leaders are appropriating the power of the place that existed there before them.
Yeah, I think what happened at Mapungubwe is seminal to the whole development of the culture. But before we go there, I know Roelien has some slides of the principal sites that we're talking about. So maybe we could go through those. Either of you, I don't know who'd like to take that.
Well, let's see them. Here we are. Khami. This of course is a World Heritage Site. Khami again.
And that's near the modern Bulawayo.
That's near modern Bulawayo, yeah. And it would be nice to acknowledge the contribution of the French embassy, who paid for the restoration of a part of that ruin. This is down in Gambi, one of the later capitals.
And where's that, Mike?
That's in central Zimbabwe. And I think this is in Janja. That's Nalatali,
No,
probably the
Nalatali,
most
yeah.
exotic of the ruins. It's absolutely stupendous in terms of decoration and site. It sits on top of a massive granite outcrop, and there is nothing higher around than it. It's absolutely beautiful.
But that looks like a medieval embattlement. Are those
Decorations. Tom will talk about the decorations later, but that is the most profusely decorated wall, I think I'm right in saying, in all the Zimbabwe palaces.
Let me add something here. Can we go back one slide to that one? Yes. Many years ago, no, the one that you just left that shows the Daga house.
Yeah.
That one. Yes, please stay there. Some years ago, I took someone from the staff at Great Zimbabwe. He was an elderly man who was part of the royal line of the Moranye chieftainship. And we drove over to get to Nalatali. In those days, I had an old Mark II Jaguar, which wasn't really a Land Rover, but we took Land Rover routes to get there. When he got to this place, now he had never seen it. In fact, on the way, he saw the first zebu cow, the one with the great big hump on its back. He saw the first one that he had forever. And he said, whoa, that's not a mumby, you know. Then we get to this place. Now it's been reconstructed since then, but you would go in an entrance just to the left. And here is this massive Daga structure. It's a circle.
Next slide. Go to the next.
There we go.
Yeah, that one, yeah.
On the left is the curve of the circle, and then off are the radiating lines. And then that met another wall which held up the roof. He looked at this thing and said, that must have been some mambo. Mambo is the traditional name for king. And he just shook his head. So we're not the only ones that get enthused when we see something like that. Many indigenous people are awed by what they see.
Yeah. Nice point.
Quite rightly. And let's talk though about, oh, sorry, carry on with the places, Mike. Zinjanja, where's that?
This is one of the, again, a second later capital. It followed, I think I'm right in saying it followed the abandonment of Khami. I think this was its immediate successor.
That's basically true. We know from Portuguese documents that Khami was blasted by Portuguese cannon in 1644. They were helping an usurper who wanted to rule, And it would appear that Zinjanja was where this winner went. It wasn't the actual, some people read the document to mean that it was the king who needed Portuguese help. But Khami wasn't rebuilt after it was destroyed. And I think the king would have done that had he been the winner. I think he's defeated. And the guy living here at Zinjanja, he's a brother or an uncle or somebody like that. But he went to what must have been his own traditional area for his own protection. This belongs to what we now call the interregnum phase between Khami and between Danengolmi that we just saw, because Danengolmi was the capital of the Roswy, the famous Changameri that went and ultimately conquered the Portuguese and so on. So this is it's fairly precisely dated between 1640 and 1680.
I have have we got time for a little anecdote about this, Patricia?
Always. On the ground.
I was at this, I think, with my wife a few years ago, and was amazed to find, and Tom will correct me, I think it's this palace. We found a hole in the ground near the king's residence that was beautifully, exquisitely lined completely with stones. And you can imagine a hole the size of a football, approximately, disappearing down into the earth, beautifully lined with stone, meticulously done. And I wrote to somebody, I think it was Tom, and said, what on earth is this? And he pointed out to me that if you're a king at these times, you're a sacred leader. And if you're a sacred leader, anything that is to do with your body, even if it's just left it, is sacred. So this has to be protected. You've got the message.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, you know, we must just go back one step, because as I understand it, it was quite an egalitarian society in those days. Before Mapungubwe, something changed there of huge import. And that was really the genesis of this massive civilization, culture, empire.
Absolutely right.
Can we go through that, Mike?
I think Tom is a better one to speak about that, but
Okay.
5 or 6, really significant changes happened there in a very short space of time. Tom.
Patricia, let me just correct one thing. The society before Mapungubwe was not egalitarian. They had chiefs, they had social ranking, but your ranking depended on your kinship relation to the chief. If for some reason he lost chieftainship, you lost your rank. But they weren't egalitarian like hunter-gatherers are supposed to be and so on. Okay.
Right.
It got much greater here because of the increase in population through floodplain agriculture, the increase in wealth through the Indian Ocean trade. All of that brought together changed the society from what's known as ranked to one based on classes. And as I said earlier, that's the mark of all complex societies. And it happened here probably because at that time, the Limpopo was like the Nile. It flooded on an annual, it was high rainfall. It's not like it is today. An African farmer couldn't make a living there today. But back then it was much higher rainfall and it flooded on an annual basis. And so they were cultivating all of these floodplains. There's a flay quite close to the confluence of the Shashi and the Limpopo rivers, and all around the margin of that, it was ideal agricultural land. So it happened here.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to ask, well, that doesn't explain why some oak suddenly put up his hand and said, I'm a sacred leader. Do we know why that's happened?
Okay, the people who study African religion tell us that if you just have local interaction, like it might have been before before the trade, let's just say before the trade, then you put an emphasis on your ancestors. But if you meet up with other cultures, if you start to become part of a multicultural situation, as the people here would have by meeting up with Swahili Arabs on the coast, who knows, maybe some kid from Mapungubwe went on a dhow to India, all those kind of things are possible. And when that happens, it changes your worldview. Mm-hmm. You see the physical world is much bigger. And when that happens, you decrease an emphasis on your ancestors and you increase an emphasis on God. And it's sometime here, particularly when the guy goes up on, you know, there's another site called K2, just 1 kilometer away, but they abandoned that place roughly 1220. They go here and a small elite group go up on top. When he does that, he's singling class distinction. He builds his first royal compartment on top of an old rainmaking place. And then a little bit later, they create the first stone walling on top of, yet again, another rainmaking place. Now, we don't know, but we take that as a physical marker of when sacred leadership had evolved, because these palaces, starting from our Portuguese knowledge and Venda today and so on, and going backwards, the palaces provided ritual seclusion for the sacred leader. He's now aloof. Not just anybody can see him. So he's living, first of all, up there. I mean, very few people get up there to see him. And then he's even behind this wall. So it's around there, and it's because of their changing understanding of the physical world and the ramifications that made to their own worldview.
And from that moment, Mike, the entire layout of these settlements changed, not so, because the hierarchy of the society was directly translated into a pecking order, how high you were up on the slope. Is that correct?
Absolutely so. In fact, in Mapungubwe, whereas everybody had physically lived on the same level, as Tom has explained, now you have the king and his immediate royal entourage on top of the hill, other royals around the hill, and commoners at the bottom of the hill. So physical separation echoing class distinction. First time ever, physically expressed like that, and then repeated endlessly for the next 600 years.
But how do we know all of this? Because having been to a couple of these sites, that it's stones stacked on stones. So can you take me through the evidence, the archaeology, how you know these things about this culture?
Well, that's easy to answer. I asked Tom, and Tom is going to tell you now. But that's a really important thing, and Tom will tell you that.
Yeah, let's talk about the stones and what they tell us.
Well, let's do the big picture first. What we do is to take the ethnography, that is the information about the culture's worldview of the living descendants. So that, first of all, are Shona speakers in Zimbabwe and Venda speakers in the northern province.
Venda, why Venda?
Well, they were Shona, they were Kalanga. Their own, there's 2 layers of Venda. The first one dates to 1450-14, and those are all Zimbabwe palaces that have crossed the Limpopo. It was part of the spread of the Khami state. Then the Roswi take over, and the very famous King Changameri Dombo Laka Chingwano, he dies after chasing the Portuguese out of the country, and there is a succession dispute over who will be the next leader. This is common. It's among sons at first, and it takes about a year. And at the end of that year, the elders have chosen on the basis of what they think the ancestors, who are speaking for God, want. And they choose one of them. Now, according to tradition, this is only 1696, so this is not so long ago. According to tradition, one of the losing sons went up to Wankie, and he started what's known as the Nambia chieftainship. The other were the Singo. They crossed the Limpopo. They conquered the pre-existing other Shona groups. They established a headquarters at a place called Zata, and they established the first Venda state. Now they came from Danangombe. So we can use information about them to apply to this later Khami period. And it's great that they still maintain class distinction and sacred leadership. They haven't been beat around like the Shona were by colonial forces, and they weren't beat around so much by the Difakani Mifakani. See, they also weren't beat around by the Portuguese. The Portuguese killed the Zimbabwe culture up in the Northeast, the Mutapa, but it continued till 1840. That's yesterday among the Khami people. And that came to an end through Swazi raids and stuff like that. But that didn't happen among Venda. So their kind of mountain fastness protected them and so on. Now they have been affected by 20th, first century stuff, but they're still cultural things that are very enduring. And class distinction is one, sacred leadership is another, how you behave. And as a result of their initiations, we've been able to identify what the symbols on the walls mean. What you're seeing now is a diagram of the order of the decorations at Nalatali, that famous one that...
Tom, can I stop you for 1 second? Mike?
What?
I was on a roll.
Mike, can I ask you, oh, sorry, Tom, it's just we're getting so much interference from your cable, Mike, that as hard as it is for you, we need you to please sit forward so we can see your little face.
Thank you.
And there we go. Now don't move, because otherwise your cable noise is making it very hard for us to hear.
Okay.
And Tom is just about to tell us about these incredible patterns, which blew my mind, even on the humble sites that we visited. Go, Tom.
Okay. There was a very fine PhD by Anitra Nettleton comparing Shona and Venda art. And that was the clue to me to how to look at these designs. On the left are what are called Hakata, the Shoning divining dice. Now there's 4 of them. They represent the major adult statuses. Sad to say, but in the Black world, children don't have status unless you count 0 as its own status. It's only adults that have real status. And the furthest one on the left is a crocodile, always a crocodile. It stands for old man who is wise and so on. On the stones, with the Khami period, it's the check design. That's where you pull out every other stone. And that's based, according to some Venda informants, on the bumps on the back, the roughness of a crocodile's back. In the Zimbabwe period, Great Zimbabwe, it was dintel. And that is derived from the ridges on the back of a crocodile. So now we know crocodile represents senior male status, which in terms of the palace is the king himself. Let me go to the far end. That wiggly thing is a snake, and it stands for the Snake of Virility. That's a young man. Next to him are woven snakes, as 2 snakes that lie together, and that's young woman. It's her fertility that is being emphasized. Now this is a pair. It's a young married couple. Then the next one over, it's always 2 or more. And that stands for unity. It's the old woman. She's either a sister, as with the king, that unifies the family, or the wife that brings 2 different lineages together. Sometimes it's the same design, 2 of the crocodiles or 2 of the snakes, that's quite variable. But it's through all of that that we can then do what's on that table. There are other kinds of snakes. There's a chevron, which represents the snake of the mountain, that has to do with rainmaking. The dark line is pool. I'll come back to that.
Okay.
And you come back down, there's a cord, that's snake of the water, which has fertility. Now, in Venda, they talk about a crocodile does not leave its pool in reference to the aloofness of a king. And often, as you see here, there's the line, which is pool, and inside of it is female crocodile, which is herringbone, the check, and then there's another line. So that's representing that statement of the aloofness of the leader inside the palace.
Yeah.
And then it depends on where you are on the walls, what they actually emphasize. But those are the core meetings.
So this is your little interpretation, not so little interpretation guide when you visit the palaces. And it played out so beautifully when we were stomping around yours, Mike, all the ones you took me to, that you could see this was the great man's sister. This was her quarters, and she was right here as his advisor, come whatever. So there is some messaging left in the stones. But
absolutely.
Is there not, Mike, still an awful lot that we will never, ever know about this major part of our Southern African history?
I'm quite certain of that. This is one of the Botswana ruins that I'm looking at now, and you can interpret that using Tom's table, but there is a great deal incorporated in this that we will never know. It's gone.
And some of that is because these sites have been destroyed by so-called archaeologists.
Well, that's some has been destroyed. That's true, but we have huge amounts of decorated stone still available.
I'm not quite as negative, Patricia, as you are. It is true that there's some stuff we'll never know, but we know the big stuff. And we can use that to look at smaller questions or whatever and make reasonable interpretations.
Well, yeah, you say we know the big stuff, but the big stuff, to my understanding, is still heavily contested. For instance, the heart of this great civilization lay at the heart of Great Zimbabwe, and at the heart of Great Zimbabwe is the Great Enclosure. And you put forward a theory on that, very well supported theory on that, Tom, but that's heavily contested, isn't it? Should we go through that?
It is indeed. This is the most contested part of the Zimbabwe pattern. I proposed this in a couple of papers in the 90s, and then I wrote a book called Snakes and Crocodiles, Power and Symbolism in Ancient Zimbabwe. I'm pushing it because it's out of print. Nobody can buy it. So I'm not and I argued there that the Great Enclosure was an initiation center. It wasn't another palace because it doesn't follow the palace organization. We have over 100 of these things that have been recorded, looked at, studied, and the Great Enclosure doesn't conform. It has lots of reversals, and that's a mark of all rites of passage, as anthropologists call them. And I've argued that this was a place where both boys and girls, after they went through their own puberty ceremonies, whatever those may have been. Now, it's possible that girls' puberty ceremonies could have also been held in the Great Enclosure, because they can't be outside. Like if you do circumcision, the boys are always outside, out in the bush. You can't do that with girls. So even a girl's puberty ceremony may well have been held inside the Great Enclosure. What I'm arguing is that this was the equivalent of a Venda Domba. It might be a mistake to use that name, but it's the equivalent. It's a premarital ceremony. You've already passed puberty. You've come here. You're here for 9 months to a year. That's on purpose, so that it is like, well, let's go. There's a famous thing called the Domba dance. It's often called the Python dance by some people. The Domba dance started off as copulation. And then throughout the year, that's the Domba dance there. Today, it's only girls, as one vendor told me, because of lack of discipline. There's no discipline anymore. And new schools have changed it all, but the girls still do this. And the dance changes its meaning. It's the same dance, but it changes its meaning from conceptualization in the beginning to gestation to, at the end, birth. And they get reborn as young adults available for marriage. Now, a king will have one of these at the beginning of his reign, so he can choose some beautiful young women to help him rule, to start his reign. After that, he allocates the right to headmen to hold it, or lower chiefs. Now, the Great Enclosure has been built in stages. It wasn't all built at one time. You see where Enclosure 1 is. Somebody's got a cursor there. That Enclosure 1 and part of the inner passage was the first thing built. And that's early on. That's at the same time as the first walling, which is roughly 1300 AD, very early on. Later on, more things are added. And during the course of the outer wall, it starts where the black arrow is at the top. It's in a certain style, a kind of poor style, and it gets better and better and better as they go around the thing. And they probably invented what's called Q coursing. It's the quality coursing. They probably invented it while they're doing this thing. Now, at the very back, it says 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the equivalents of the Hakata. The one in front are zebra stripes.
Okay, can I just,
light.
Tom?
Yeah.
Tom, I'm just worried about us going into too much depth because we're going to run out of time.
Okay, well, there's the proof.
Yeah.
I don't know how anybody can argue with it. There's the proof.
But people do. And my head,
They do.
do they? So people have to contact you for the depths of that academic argument. But we do have several questions lined up for us. So I would like to end our discussion before we go to the audience by asking you, Mike, what you hope this book instills in us as Southern Africans. Mike,
sorry, Mike, you must just unmute yourself quickly.
Mike, you appear to be muted.
Is that better?
There we go. Go for it, Mike.
Okay, one word, awareness. I went through a process of learning and discovering and came to realize the extent of this story. And at the same time, I realized how little it is known by the general public. In Botswana in particular, with all the ruins that we have, I doubt if more than 20 or 30 people have any inkling of what this is about. So there's no pride of possession, there's no pride of heritage. And my purpose was to try and bring this to the public, not only in Botswana, but in Southern Africa as a whole, because we have such an incredible heritage and it's an amazing story. And people need to know about it and value it.
Yeah, you know, if I could add an anecdote to that. Do you remember we were stomping around one of the sites and we were in the company of a young Botswana woman?
Oh,
very
yes,
well
that's right.
educated.
Yes.
She was a hostess at a local lodge, a hunting lodge.
That's right.
And she said, yeah, I know where they are. And we took her there and she said, oh, I thought a whole lot of white people came and built these. She had no idea,
right.
that no one else on the property, that they were built by, you know, her ancestors, you know, broadly speaking. And I do agree with somebody's, it's Leon Jacobson, who said that a copy of this book should be in every school library. It's so
I agree with that.
And it instills such pride, even though I'm not of that particular culture. I'm a Southern African, and I'm just awed by what was here and what was done. So let me just go to a couple of these excellent questions. For instance, Verena
let's
asks,
hope other people are as awed as you are.
well, I say they must be, okay.
You're right. Patricia has spoken.
Yes. Sally Wilkins wants to know, what is known about the role and position of women in this society? Who would like to tackle that?
Tom will talk to you about that definitely.
Okay. Short, Tom, because we've got a few to get through.
Women in the Zimbabwe culture had a better position than in surrounding groups like Zulu. The senior sister represented the female side of the ruling line. Female ancestors as her female line were prayed to. Some of the Zimbabwe birds represent kings. The other ones represent senior sisters. They had an exalted position. Don't forget, though, of course, that it's still a male-dominated society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we haven't even had time to go to the birds, the Zimbabwe birds, which is another fascinating story. Mike, here's a question I know you can answer for us. Which criteria, from Brietta Prinsloo, which criteria turns a place into a rainmaking site? How do you know that it was a rainmaking site?
Well, there'll be detritus left from the ceremonies that take place, and Tom has done a lot of work on dating some of those sites. In my own experience in Botswana, it's always a elevated place. It can be very elevated. It can be remote from a village, so that there's no interference from the people. And I have often gone to small hills and found parked on top of them a pile of branches waiting to be lit in order that the smoke will take messages to the ancestors and above. So it's an elevated place, often remote from a village, and there are innumerable such sites wherever they are handy, but they tend to be used for a very long time, as in the case of Great Zimbabwe itself.
Yeah, I think that answers your question, Jackie Thompson, as well. I like this other one from Jackie. She asks to Prof and Mike, what has been your most breathtaking site or discovery, be it location or an artifact? Mike, you go first.
Location.
Which location and why?
Oh, now you're pushing it. I think one of the Botswana sites, one of the Majandi sites, probably Lower Majandi, is absolutely amazing. It is our most dramatic site.
And for you, Tom?
I think it was sorting out the Zimbabwe pattern at Great Zimbabwe. I had read a paper about the organization of space among Bantu-speaking peoples, and I went to look at the maps and everything for Great Zimbabwe, and within about a 2-week period, I made this discovery, that discovery, this discovery. It was really exhilarating. It's very irritating that 40 years later, I'm still trying to convince some people that this makes sense, but that's the way it goes.
I like this question too from Verena Brandon. She says, do we know who did the construction? Was it honorable work or otherwise? It was surely a lot of work because I saw that with my own eyes, but was it honorable work?
No reason why not. It's not slaves. These are people who build things as a part of labor tribute, a tax, if you will, to the king. And even in Zimbabwe today, there are work groups that when the chief demands that they go out and help with the road or do stuff like that, work parties. And I'm sure that this was the situation back then. Slavery wasn't an issue in those days. This was a form of tribute.
Yeah, and it's still the case in Botswana. The chief will wave his hand and the workers will appear. It's part of the obligation.
Okay, so you're saying that it wasn't slaves that carried all this ivory, etc., to the coast?
No,
that's a different question.
Yeah.
We didn't say that. You were talking about building, and
I
would think it was. Now. But there is no, so far as I know, there is no clear evidence of slavery. There's a set of manacles, iron manacles, found at one of the central Zimbabwe sites in Zimbabwe, and I think they might be loot from a raid on Portuguese settlements. But that's the only physical link to slavery that I know of. Tom?
Yes, and that's not even a link to slavery, so to speak. That could just be somebody arrested for murder or whatever. Yeah. Look, everything you can think of about how people got from the coast to the interior and back again probably happened at some time or another. Could have been caravans, could have been, we know for sure that the Mana Matapa sent emissaries down to Sofala after the Portuguese took over. And they carried a bit of gold and a few other things as gifts and whatever. I mean, you can walk it. And if I don't know the documents well enough to tell me that caravans were made up of slaves. There could have been indentured servants. Later on, the Portuguese brought people from an island off of India that became Christian, and they used them as traders for themselves and stuff. But I for one, don't buy slavery as a big issue.
Agreed.
But I mean, this was a time of great warfare. It was hardly bucolic, peace for 600 years, was it? Wasn't it?
No, you're right. Look, some of these things get so big. Great Zimbabwe and Khami state, they probably both control 90,000 square kilometers. You have district governors and then under them chiefs and so on. And those guys can be so far away. All they have to do, put out their fire once a year, send in a bit of tribute once a year, and they're now ruling on behalf of the king. But they can see the throne ahead of them. They can be ambitious like all men are everywhere, and they can break off, and rebellions were common. And in fact, the Portuguese just came in at the tail end of a civil war between the guys at Khami and the Mana Matapa. So yes, definitely. In fact, that interrupted trade. When that happened, people were not trading. And that was one of the ill effects for the Mutapa dynasty.
A comment and a question here. The comment is from Julia Majaha Jatbi, who comments that it's true about the lack of value with respect to stone ruins. She comes or grew up in Masungu, very close to Dombashawa ruins. And by the time they were preserved, the goats and the cattle had demolished most of the structures. And she asks you, Mike, what's been done today to sensitize the public about the importance of preserving these ruins?
Nothing sufficient. There are offhand, I think, two sites that have custodians who sit there. There were two other sites that used to have custodians, but the custodian has been withdrawn for want of funds on behalf of the museum. The museum keeps the records, but at a national level, there is absolutely no effort to try and popularize this story, to recognize the importance of the sites. Nothing at all. In fact, if we got a second, my wife and I were at a site very near Julia's house where we met a man with a bucky. And we said, we were at a beautiful little gem of a site. And we said, what are you doing here? He said, I'm building a bottle store. Oh, we said, that's interesting. Well done. Where are you getting the stone from? I'm getting the stone from here. And he was dismantling a priceless Zimbabwe ruin to build a bottle store. But he was prosecuted. He paid 50 Rand fine. So that's a measure of where we are.
Oh, shocking. Roelien, I'm relying on you to shut me up because I'm having too much fun. And there's a great question from Kate Rogan, who asks, is there any link between these civilizations and those of the Bocconi in the Leidenberg area? Tom?
The answer is no.
Okay, good.
Bocconi is much later.
Okay.
Much later and entirely different people.
And Francis van Melson asks what these ancient civilizations can teach us. Well, maybe, for my money, it's that women had a lot of say in what went on. Not that I'm biased, right?
Yes, there is some bias there, but it just makes you realize that we tend to look at the past, particularly in Africa, and we look down our noses at it. But the fact is, you don't run a state the size that Tom has described without having some very sophisticated, clever people running and organizing it. And we need to realize that that's the case. It's not an empty history book at all.
Roelien, may I have one more question?
One more question, absolutely.
And this plays into we haven't really talked much about the demise of this civilization, and it came in waves, as I understand it. It was, the Matabele, et cetera, and then the final blows from the Portuguese and other colonists. David Lampkin asks, though, that about the Indian Ocean trade. It had existed from very early on. And his question is, would Monomotapa have flourished without that pre-existing trade system? As quick as you can, please.
No, he wouldn't have. Is that quick enough?
That's quick enough. It's quick enough. You have to read the book to read about the demise. But Roelien, your work is cut out for you now. Please make sure that this book becomes a prescribed work in every school in Southern Africa. And I will do my best to publicize it further by means of the podcast, which I've recorded with Mike Main, and which I hope will go out in about 6 weeks' time as part of my series. I thank you all so much for this blast, this really interesting and lively session. And all strength to you, Tom Huffman and Mike Main. Thank you.
Thank you,
Patricia.
Oh, do you hear my no, you probably can't hear the jackals going, woo, 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 woo.
Sounds very appropriate at this moment. Thank you to the three of you for this incredibly lively conversation and discussion about this early history of Southern Africa, which could seem very difficult to understand, but you've presented it in such an interesting way, and it's definitely opened up a window in terms of understanding our sort of prehistory. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Patricia.
Thank you, Roelien.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you also to everyone who all the participants. I do want to let you know that the book is for sale at a discounted price, and I will put up a slide shortly for you to see all those details. The discounted price is 192 Rand. The book is available on our very brand new online bookstore on Struik Nature, the Struik Nature Club's online bookstore, and the website. Belinda will put that in the chat, and I'll put the slide up now so you can see that. That discount is valid until Tuesday, and you do need to use a voucher code STONE, STONE, when you place your order on the site. So I'm going to do that now, and then just to say thank you to everyone for being here tonight. I also do want to say that the discount for our visitors from other parts of the world, the discount, unfortunately, is only available in South Africa and won't be available to others. The normal price is 240 Rand, and that's what you will probably pay for it on Amazon, certainly in the UK, Europe, and in the US. I'm just sharing going past the last few slides, and then here you can get all the information about the discount. And just to say thank you to everyone for being here. Okay.
Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Are we off live? Are we not live anymore?
We are live, and we're going to go offline in about 10 seconds or so. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Signing
everyone.
off.